The morning Elias Vance placed an advertisement for a housekeeper, he tore up 4 drafts before he let himself write the truth. That he did not want a wife, only someone to keep his 2 children from growing up wild and motherless. He was 38 years old, and he had not spoken his late wife's name aloud in 11 months. The words felt like river stones in his mouth, too heavy to lift, too smooth to hold. So he wrote instead of what he needed. A woman of good character, able to cook, to mend, to raise young ones. No affection expected, none offered. He signed it plainly and mailed it from the little post office in Larkspur Bend, and he told himself that was the end of the matter. What he did not know, what he could not have known that gray October morning, was that the woman who answered would give his children something he had stopped believing existed in the world, and would ask for nothing in return. Her name was Hannah Coombs, and she was 31 years old when she stepped down from the stage in Larkspur Bend with a single carpet bag and a face that had learned, somewhere along the hard road of her life, how to stay calm when everything inside it was trembling. Elias met her at the depot, with his hat in his hands. He had brought the wagon and left the children at home with the neighbor woman because he did not want them to see their new housekeeper before he had taken her measure himself. Hannah looked at him, the tired set of his shoulders, the careful distance he kept even as he reached for her bag, and she understood a great deal without a single word being spoken. "You're Mr. Vance," she said. "It was not a question. I am. And you're Miss Coombs." He cleared his throat. "I'll be honest with you at the start, so there's no confusion later. This is a house of business. You'll have your own room, fair wages, and Sundays free. I'm not looking for a wife. I had one. That's finished." Hannah nodded slowly, and if the bluntness of it stung her, she did not let it show. "I understand you plain, Mr. Vance," she said. "I didn't come looking for a husband. I came looking for a place to be useful. And that, at least, was the honest truth between them, though neither of them yet knew how much the word useful could stretch to hold. The Vance homestead sat 2 miles out along Sparrow Creek, a low clapboard house with a good barn and a garden gone to seed. When the wagon rolled into the yard, the front door opened, and 2 small figures spilled out onto the porch, and Hannah's breath caught in her chest at the sight of them. The boy was 9, all elbows and wary eyes, and he stood in front of his little sister, the way a soldier stands in front of something he means to protect. His name was Samuel. The girl behind him was 6 years old, with her father's dark hair and a rag doll clutched to her chest, and her name was Beth. Neither child said a word. They only watched the stranger climb down from the wagon, and Hannah saw in their faces the particular stillness of children who had learned that new people usually meant new leavings. She did not rush them. She had learned patience, the way some people learn it, the hard way, over years, in houses that were not her own. She simply crouched down in the yard so that she was no taller than the boy, and she said, "You must be Samuel. Your father tells me you're a great help to him. I expect I'll be needing a great deal of help myself, learning where everything is." Samuel said nothing, but he did not step back either. And little Beth peeked out from behind him with one bright, curious eye, and that was enough for a beginning. That night, after the children were abed, Elias sat at the kitchen table and watched Hannah move through his dead wife's kitchen as though she were afraid of waking something. She found the flour, the salt, the dented coffee pot. She did not ask where things belonged. She simply set them right, quietly, and Elias felt something twist in his chest that he did not have a name for and did not want to find one. The days settled into a rhythm after that, and the rhythm was a mercy to all of them. Hannah rose before the sun and had the fire going and the porridge warm before the children stirred. She mended the tears in Samuel's trousers that his father had never noticed. She washed Beth's hair with rainwater and combed the tangles out so gently that the little girl fell asleep against her knee. She did not try to be their mother. She never once asked them to call her anything but Miss Hannah. But she was there, steady as the seasons, and children know the weight of a steady thing better than any grown soul alive. It was Beth who broke first, as the youngest often do. 3 weeks in, on a cold night when the wind came down off the ridge like a living thing, Beth woke crying from a dream she could not explain, and it was Hannah who reached her first. Elias came to the doorway and stopped, because what he saw there stopped him cold. Hannah had gathered his daughter up against her shoulder, and she was singing, low, half under her breath, an old hymn about a river and a far green shore. Beth's crying had gone quiet, and Elias stood in the dark hallway of his own house and felt 11 months of frozen grief crack straight down the middle, because his wife used to sing that very hymn, and he had thought that song had died with her. He went back to his room without a word, but he did not sleep, and in the morning, when Hannah set his coffee before him, he said gruffly, "Thank you for last night." It was the first thanks he had given her that was not about the cooking or the wash. Hannah only nodded, but something in the house had shifted, the way a river shifts its course by a single inch, and once such a thing begins it cannot easily be undone. Samuel took longer, as the oldest often do, for the oldest remember the most and trust the slowest. He watched Hannah with careful eyes all through those first weeks, testing her the small hard ways that wounded children test the grown, leaving his chores half done, answering short, waiting to see when her patience would finally run out and show him the sharp edge he was certain lived underneath. But the edge never came, and one raw morning, when the boy came in from the cold with his hands split and bleeding from mending fence, in weather too hard for a child, it was Hannah who took those small ruined hands in hers, without a word of scolding, and warmed them, and salved them, and wrapped them, and only then said quietly, "You've been carrying more than a boy your age should have to carry, Samuel. You don't have to carry it alone anymore." And the boy, who had not cried once since his mother died, put his bandaged face against her shoulder and wept like the child he still was. From that morning on, he called her Miss Hannah, in a voice that had stopped waiting for her to leave. If the story had been left to Hannah and the children, it might have found its gentle way on its own. But every homestead has its watchers, and the fiercest watcher of the Vance house lived 4 miles down the road, and her name was Prudence Hale. Prudence was the mother of Elias's late wife, 62 years old, straight-backed, and hard as a hickory knot with grief she had never once set down. She had loved her daughter more than she loved her own breath, and when her daughter had passed, quietly, in her sleep, of a fever that took her over 3 still winter days, Prudence had folded all that love into a fist and decided that no woman would ever stand in her daughter's kitchen again. When word reached her that Elias had brought a woman out from the city, Prudence Hale put on her black bonnet and drove her buggy to Sparrow Creek to see what manner of scheming creature had come to steal her grandchildren's affection. She arrived on a Sunday, unannounced, and she found Hannah in the garden with Beth, the 2 of them on their knees in the dark earth, planting something out of season that would likely never grow. Prudence stood at the gate and looked at the woman's plain dress and reddened hands, and she said, in a voice like the crack of dry wood, "So, you're the one who thinks she can fill my daughter's shoes." Hannah rose from the garden slowly. She wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at the old woman's face, really looked, and she saw past the anger to the thing underneath it, the way she had learned to do in all those hard years. "No, ma'am," she said quietly, "I don't think anyone could fill them. I'm only trying to keep the children's feet warm until they're grown enough to walk in shoes of their own." Prudence had come armed for a fight, and Hannah had refused to give her one. She told herself she was making certain this stranger did no harm, but what she saw, week after week, was a thing she had no defense against. She saw Hannah slip an extra biscuit into Samuel's pocket for the walk to school. She saw her sit up half a night with Beth when the child ran a fever, sponging her small hot forehead until the dawn. She saw her patch and darn and scrub and rise and never once, not one single time, ask Elias Vance for a kind word or a coin more than her wages. And Prudence Hale, who had spent 2 years believing her heart was closed for good, found it opening against her will, the way a fist cannot stay clenched forever without aching. The turn came on a bitter afternoon in December. Prudence had driven out in weather she had no business driving in, and halfway home, her buggy wheels struck a frozen rut and cracked, and the old woman was thrown down hard onto the icy road. It was Hannah who found her, near dark, walking the fence line to bring the milk cow in. Hannah who half carried the injured woman back to the house through the cold. Hannah who set her by the fire and bound her turned ankle and fed her broth with her own hand as though Prudence had never spoken a hard word to her in her life. Prudence lay on the settle by the fire that night, warm and mended and undone, and she watched Hannah move quietly through the lamplit house, and at last the old woman spoke into the dark. "Why?" she said. Her voice was not sharp now. It only sounded tired and very old. "After the way I came at you. Why would you do all this?" Hannah paused with the kettle in her hand. "Because you loved her," she said simply. "The children's mother. You loved her so much you couldn't bear to see anyone stand where she stood. That's not cruelty, ma'am. That's grief wearing cruelty's coat. I've worn it myself." She set the kettle down. "I'm not here to take her place. There isn't any taking a place like that. I'm only here so those 2 little ones don't grow up in a cold house. And I'd think you and I want the very same thing, when it comes down to it." For a long moment, the only sound was the fire. And then Prudence Hale, who had not wept since the day they lowered her daughter into the ground, put her weathered hand over her eyes and cried at last, not the bitter tears she'd carried like stones, but the other kind, the kind that finally lets a thing go. Hannah sat beside her and held her hand and said not one word more, because some griefs need no words, only company. After that night, everything was different, and everyone in that house could feel it. Prudence began coming on Sundays as a friend and not a spy. She taught Hannah her daughter's receipt for apple butter, the one the children loved, and when Beth licked the spoon and declared it just like before, the old woman and the young one looked at each other over the child's head, and something passed between them that was gentler than either had expected to feel again. And Elias watched it all. Elias, who had built a wall around his heart 11 months back and mortared it with grief, he watched this woman he'd hired for wages knit his broken household back together, thread by patient thread, and he began to understand that he had been wrong about the terms of their arrangement from the very start. He had asked for a mother for his children. He had said plainly, not a wife, and Hannah had honored that, every day, asking nothing, presuming nothing, staying always just to the far side of the line he'd drawn. But a man cannot watch true kindness at work under his own roof, season upon season, and stay frozen forever. The thaw comes whether he wills it or no. It was spring when he finally spoke. The garden Beth and Hannah had planted out of season come up green after all, against every expectation, a row of hardy things that had no business surviving the winter and had survived it anyway. Elias found Hannah among them one evening, and he stood a long while with his hat in his hands, the same as the day he'd met her at the depot, and at last he said the hardest and truest thing he had said in 2 years. "I told you when you came that this was a house of business," he said, "that I wasn't looking for a wife. I meant it then. I want you to know I meant it." He turned his hat in his rough hands. "But I was a fool, Hannah. I asked you for so little, because little was all I thought I had left to give. and you gave my children everything. You gave me back a song I thought I'd buried. You mended a house I'd given up on, and you never once asked me for a thing." He looked up, and his eyes were wet, and he did not hide it. "I've no right to ask you now, but I'd be honored, humbled, if you'd stay. Not for wages, as my wife, as Beth and Samuel's mother, plain and true, if you'll have a broken sort of man and the family he comes with." Hannah stood among the green things she'd planted, and for a moment she could not speak at all, because in all her hard years, no one had ever offered her a home, and meant it. When she found her voice, it shook. "I came here looking for a place to be useful, Mr. Vance," she said. "I didn't dare hope to find a place to belong." She smiled, and it was the first full smile he had ever seen from her. "Yes, I'll stay. I'll have you, and gladly." They were married that June, in the little church at Larkspur Bend, on a morning so bright it seemed the whole valley had turned out green to bless them. Samuel, 10 now and grown a full inch over the winter, stood up beside his father in a borrowed coat. Beth, 7, scattered wildflowers down the aisle from a basket, and when she reached the front, she abandoned all ceremony and flung her arms around Hannah's skirts and would not let go. And in the front pew sat Prudence Hale in her black bonnet. But she had pinned a sprig of green to it, and she was smiling through her tears, and when the parson asked who gave this woman to be married, it was Prudence who rose, straight-backed and steady, and said in her cracked, strong voice, "I do." For she had come to understand, in the long, slow way that the truest understandings come, that love does not divide when you share it out, it multiplies. Her daughter's memory was not diminished by the woman who had come after. It was honored by her, kept warm by her, carried forward into 2 small lives that would have grown cold without her. And that was not a betrayal of the dead, it was the finest gift the living could give them. Years later, when Beth was grown and had children of her own, she would tell them the story of how their grandmother came to their family, how a man had asked only for a mother for his children, and had been given, unasked, a whole new heart for his whole broken house. She would tell them how Hannah never once tried to replace what was lost, and how, in not trying, she healed it. And she would tell them always of the stern old woman who learned that a fist held shut too long only aches, and that the bravest thing a grieving heart can do is open again. Hannah Vance lived to be very old, and she was loved every single day of it. And on the mantel of that clapboard house by Sparrow Creek, all her long life, she kept 2 things side by side, a faded photograph of the woman who had come before her, and a sprig of dried green from a garden that had no business surviving the winter, and had survived it anyway. Because some things, planted in the coldest season by patient and unasking hands, grow all the more sweetly for it. And a home, once a kind heart has warmed it, need never go cold again.